What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here, and thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today, we're going to be working on a 1996 Land Rover Discovery 1. Typically, we recommend you do your spark plugs every 30,000 miles or so. The wires and the ignition coil are going to last quite a bit longer. The unit behind us has about 174,000 miles. We're not too sure about the state of the ignition coil. It is running properly right now, but it is showing a little bit of age, so we're just going to go ahead and replace it for sake of this video. The plugs, again, every 30,000 miles, and wires kind of go hand in hand with the ignition coil. It's pretty easy to tell when a wire goes bad. An easy thing you can do is run the car in the dark and see if you can see any electricity arcing out of the wires. Sometimes you can touch them and feel a little bit of zap, then you know they're going bad. Oftentimes over the years, the rubber will break down, it'll get brittle, the boots will get hard. Sometimes they will snap in extreme cases. Same thing goes with your ignition coil. As these age and start to fail, you'll develop a misfire. Once you've ruled out that it's not a plug or a wire, more than likely it's going to be your coil, in which case it's going to be kind of like a cassette like this, where all four bodies are bolted onto one bracket. You're going to want to replace the whole thing. Now, before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this job, you're going to need a ratchet, maybe a couple extensions or swivel sockets, depending on how you're working. You're going to need a 21 millimeter spark plug socket. We have a 10 millimeter socket. We have a spark plug gapper tool. We have a small magnet tool. This will help with fishing out the hardware for the ignition coil. I have two different paint markers. I have a silver Sharpie and a blue Sharpie. This will help with keeping everything organized while we're doing this job. Some dielectric grease is great for these type of tune-ups. We have a small torque wrench and an electric ratchet should we need it to remove any hardware while we're doing this DIY. But now that we know what we're working with, let's go ahead and get started on this job. All right, my good people, we're going to start on the passenger side bank of the engine today. We're going to be showing you how to do a plug and a wire, and then we're going to move on to the ignition coil. The plug and wire process is going to repeat just 7 more times on the block. It's pretty straightforward. These engines are pretty easy to work on. Just make sure you stretch before you get in here, because everything's kind of a far reach, even for a tall guy like me. So a couple of things I want to know is whenever you're doing plugs and wires on a vehicle that you have more than 4 maybe, V6, V8, whatever the case may be, the best thing you can do is be organized. Do one at a time. There's no reason to rush or rip everything out at once. However, there are diagrams online should you be starting from a different point. Maybe you didn't take the car apart and you're trying to put it back together. The ignition coil does have a cylinder number on it per each cylinder, and it gives you the order on which side of the bank the plugs are coming from. In addition to that, the new wires we're installing are also labeled with which wire goes to which cylinder, so it makes life a little bit easier. Personally, I like to take it one at a time. I will pull out the one plug, swap it out, then I will remove the spark plug cable. I will follow that all the way to the ignition coil, take that one out, match it up with one of my new ones, reinstall it, and then just repeat the process all the way across. So that's what we're going to do today. And then at the very end, once we have all the plugs and cables swapped out, I'm going to go ahead and swap out the ignition coil. There's no particular order in which you have to do this. You can start with swapping out the ignition coil first and then doing your wires and plugs. Totally up to you. But this is just the way we're going to work today. Is we're going to do the plug, the wire, and then the coil. So to get started, we're going to reach down. I'm going to start with the frontmost passenger side spark plug and show you how to swap that one out. So we'll go ahead and just pull the plug straight back, or the plug wire straight back. Sometimes these can be on there a little bit tight if they've been on there for a long time. So we're going to go ahead and just pull that off for now and set it to the side. Again, the goal here being organized. Maybe you're not doing plug wires, you're just doing plugs, then you don't need to pull the wire there off the rest of the way. From there, we're going to switch over to our ratchet. We have our 21 millimeter socket, and we're just going to work on breaking that spark plug free and backing it out. Sometimes they can be a little bit tight in there. The torque spec isn't too high for these. It's about 20 Newton meters. It is an aluminum block, so you don't want to, or aluminum head, I should say, so you don't want to damage the threads, otherwise it's going to turn into a more pain in the butt repair than needs to be. Here's our old plug. This is also a good time to inspect the plugs, see how they look. This car is running super rich, but we know that for a fact, which is something we're working on here in the shop. These are not that old. but you can see how black, sooty, and fuel smelly they are. Can you smell that? Regardless, we're here to change them. Before you install your new spark plug, you want to make sure that they're gapped properly. Now these older style Champions, not a stab at you Champion, but they don't include any sleeving in the packaging, so they kind of bounce around, unlike your newer plugs that have like fine electrodes and all that good stuff. Those come a little bit more protected from the factory. So we're going to check our gap before we install our new plug. And using our spark plug tool, we're simply going to check it first before we modify anything on it. Now for this engine, Land Rover calls about 0.032 inches. As long as you're between that and maybe 0.35, that'll be a nice spot for this engine. This one's scapped a little bit more open than need be. It's nearing about 0.37, 0.38. So what we're going to do is we're going to close the gap a little bit. We're just going to use the tool itself and kind of push it in against the quarter gap right here, just a little bit. And we can go back and check it. And we still need a little bit more, a little bit more. You don't want to bash these against the table. You can risk breaking them or fracturing the ceramic portion of them internally, and then you're going to have a misfire. So right here, we're about 0.033. That's going to be okay for the spec that we're looking for. This gapper also has an opening. It says gap opener on this style, which you would wedge in and pull back on if you were to open up the plug instead of closing it. So in this case, we had to close it a little bit more. We checked it, it looks good. Now we're going to go ahead and just start it by hand first. You always want to start your plugs by hand. You don't want to get in right away with a ratchet. You can use an extension with your socket if you can't reach. These are pretty easy to get to though, so we're going to start it by hand. Get a feel, make sure that they're seating into the threads properly. All right, now that we have it started, I'm just going to take my extension setup and snug it up the rest of the way by hand. And these plugs, usually once you snug them up, another 1/8 of a turn will do. Because we have the torque wrench out, we're just going to go ahead and snug them up to 20 Newton meters since we have the tool available. But if you don't have a torque wrench, usually about an 1/8 turn once they've snugged up is all you need. Not very tight. It's better to always have to go back and snug it up a little bit more than have to fix some threads. So just keep that in mind. All right. There we go. And now at this case, if you're not replacing your wires, simply inspect the boot. If you need to, you can add a little bit of dielectric grease to it and pop it back onto the plug. But because we are going to be replacing them, what we're going to do instead now is we're going to follow this wire all the way back up to the ignition coil. There's a couple little ears coming off the valve cover that these key into to kind of keep everything organized and off of the headers. So just pop them off one at a time as you see them. So we're going to go ahead and do that now and take it off all the way up to the ignition coil. And we're going to follow the line. We're going to go ahead and then clip it up top here. And we're going to find it underneath this fuel line. Just one more clip underneath the fuel line here, the sheathing to that line. And then just push the line back. Let it bow out somewhere back here where you can find it once more. And same thing, there's another clip here, just holding the 4 lines from this side together, or 4 cables, I should say. And then our cable, I'm going to pull it through. And that's going to be our first one here on our ignition coil. Just go ahead and pop it straight up. All right, and with that, my good people, we have pulled out our first cable. Now, what I'm going to do is take these over to the workbench, match them up with the new ones. These old ones, as you may or may not see, are not too old actually. These are numbered as well, but I'm not going to trust it right off the bat. I'm going to make sure I have the right one. Then we can come back and route the new one in. And from there, we're going to repeat the process across the board for the rest of them. And then we'll pick it back up with swapping out the ignition coil. So give me 1 second. We'll grab our new cable, feed it in, and go from there. Here we have our new cable ready to rock and roll. And I'm just going to feed it kind of taking the path of the least resistance, which is going to be from the front over to the back. That way I don't have to swing the whole thicker end of the cable through. So I'm just going to loosely route it the way the old one came out. We're not clipping anything in yet. Our goal is to get it over to the ignition coil first. Once we have it at our ignition coil, At this point, if you're not replacing the coil, you are more than welcome to use a small dab of dielectric grease on the cable end there. Feed that in, make sure it clips in all the way. And now you can start tucking your line in back on any grommets or clips that were holding it on the way over. So we had one right over here by our AC line. We had two underneath these fuel lines. One is a little bit buried, hard to see, but it is there. You just feel for it. And we have our second one right here. And the first spark plug happens to have another one at the end of the valve cover here. And now we can simply go ahead and plug in our boot. Same thing here. You're more than welcome to use a bit of dielectric grease on the end of this boot. Just don't do too much. Feed that in. And you want to hear it click in. Beautiful. Give it a slight tug. Make sure it's not going to pop right off. And now rinse and repeat for the other 7. All right, at this point we have our new plug-in, we have our new wire in. The process is going to be the same for the other 7. Of course, the driver's side might be a little bit more tougher to reach, but the idea remains the same. Now we're going to switch over to the ignition coil, and staying with the theme of organization here, we're going to start by labeling all the spark plug wires. Even though the wires are labeled and the ignition coil is also labeled, it never hurts to be extra cautious. In this case, I'm just going to simply go really simple and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 across the top. And that's the same way we're going to reinstall them on our new ignition coil. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to use a paint pen to mark my ignition coil wires here, and my spark plug wires. And you can label these however you want. You can label them per the cylinder that they're going to. You can label them per the number on the ignition coil itself. But for me, this is just super simple. Every car is going to be a little bit different, but the idea remains the same. The key here is just to be organized. And now with all the wires labeled, at this point you can go ahead and just pop them off and kind of let them set to the side. And we'll have an electrical connector to get to and 4 10mm nuts holding this in. All right, with all our cables unplugged, now we can tackle our electrical connector that's right here. So let's go ahead and do that next. All right, on the top of the connector here, you can press down and it'll release the locking tab. You can pull back. That'll free up the connector going to the ignition coil. And now carefully, we have 2 10mm nuts up here, one on the back and one down straight below. You're gonna need an extension to get to both of those. We'll go ahead and pull these off, and then we'll hop over to the passenger bank and do the exact same thing. Be very careful not to drop it back and send it down below. And now with all 4 of those out, we can fish this ignition coil out. And come forward towards the firewall once you get it off the studs. Make sure nothing's getting hung up on it. This vacuum line is going to have to come undone. Just pull it off straight back. Let's see. There we go. No need to undo that. And then we can pull it straight out. Now we're going to feed our new ignition coil in, kind of the same way the old one came out, being mindful of that vacuum line on the driver's side bank. We should have one stud that we can still attach this to. That'll help us line it up. All right, my good people. Now comes the balancing act of getting our nuts and or stud and nut combo back on without losing them. That's always the tricky part. With our ignition coil in place, situated over our studs, hopefully your studs remained put, we can go ahead and get our nuts started back on. This can be a little bit tricky, so it's a little bit tight to work with. A magnet tool will be your friend if you're unable to reach your fingers in here, which is what I'm going to have to do. Just get my nut on the end of my magnet, get it kind of situated over the stud. Just get a couple threads to catch, and then I can pull the magnet off. Now we have all 4 situated. At this point, we can reconnect our spark plug wires in the same order that we took them off. And if you want, a little bit of dielectric grease goes a long way before you reinstall them. And last but not least, we have our electrical connector. Plug right back into the harness. And with that, my good people, that is going to conclude this DIY for our ignition service on this Disco 1. Overall, a really straightforward job. Honestly, the most tedious thing is just using this thing as a jungle gym to access the hardware on the back coil bracket. But other than that, pretty straightforward. Again, work slow, we're organized, and you should have no problem. Make sure you look online if you messed up the firing order, or if you're starting from scratch and you don't know what the firing order is. We'll also be sure to leave that in the description below for you. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.